Please join me inside for 50 years of social documentary and street photography. There are 43 photographs in my retrospective, which represent a fraction of my work over 50 plus years. Today I'll show you 28 of those. Please visit my website for more information at michael-hyatt.com. Note that the title of this retrospective is Pictures at an Exhibition, and that the music is from Mussorgsky's Pictures at an Exhibition. What is the connection between this music and my photography? It's the recurring dualism theme that frames my work and the recurring promenade theme that frames Mussorgsky's brilliant composition. Great music like this has enriched my life since childhood and inspired my artistic efforts. These two photographs, the first made in 1969 and the second in 2019, reflect a consistent vision, that is, my original voice. Peace March on the left set the stage for making subjective imagery with contrasting elements. Having grown up in a home and in a country divided, politics just being one example of the schism, my stage was already set when I discovered that photography would be my medium for self-expression. The photograph on the right, and all photographs in this exhibit, reflect my personal journey seeking a worldview that balances diverse experiences. Mysteries surrounding the unconscious mind direct my actions to seek and capture narratives employing duality of balance in photographic form. After being drafted into the U.S. Navy in 1965, and after serving in Vietnam, I was discharged and began my college years in the fall of 1968 in Southern California. I quickly gravitated to the anti-war faction on campus while taking basic photography and art classes. Dorothea Lange, Walker Evans, and Henri Cartier-Bresson were early influences on my interest in documentary and street photography. John Lennon and Yoko Ono's song, Give Peace a Chance, released by the Plastic Ono Band in 1969, became an anthem of the American anti-war movement. The song's title was a catalyst for growing sentiment among many Americans appalled by the rising death toll of American soldiers and the stalemate in Vietnam. This photograph reflects both sides of the polarized sentiment of the time by uniting opposing visual elements to achieve a duality of balance. My activism back in the late 60s has extended to social justice work in the borderlands of Mexico and Arizona, and in this case to the rights of miners for fair wages and safe working conditions. While in Mexico City, I documented several social justice marches on Paseo de la Reforma, where the Angel of Independence majestically stands. Note that regardless of the ethnic and cultural differences between these two Mexican women, they are united in solidarity of purpose. In 1979, I spent a month hitchhiking through the Republic of Ireland. On Election Day in Bandon, I documented activities around a polling station and the nearby neighborhood. The massive poster in this photograph promotes the candidates for Labour, one of four main political parties seeking representation in the European Union then. 30 years later, the library in Bandon hosted an exhibit of a dozen of my photographs from that day. During my visit for the reception in 2007, I noticed that the ethnic mix in Ireland had changed dramatically and that the economic boom that brought in workers from Central Europe and Africa, referred to as the Celtic Tiger, was already experiencing a housing bubble and a recession. Near the beginning of my travels in Ireland, I met Deirdre Creed in Tralee. She is seen here in a silver jacket in the middle of the photograph with other members of Ireland's only all-female punk rock band, the Boy Scouts, following their performance at an anti-nuclear demonstration. Deirdre introduced me to punk rock music and inspired me to photograph the genre upon my return to California. I'd heard about the Hollywood music scene with its misfit artists, poets, and musicians, and the colorful nightlife at a club called The Mask. Then I met Tito La Riva, lead singer and guitarist for The Plugs. Tito invited me to see the band perform at the Starwood. I was immediately captivated by their original songs, their fans' punk fashion sense, and by their revved-up version of the classic Mexican folk song, La Bamba. I began photographing the band and made this portrait in 1980 at the Olympic Auditorium. The Plugs used my portrait to promote their shows. Artist Richard Duardo produced a large silkscreen poster showcasing the portrait, which John Doe and Exene Cervenka saw. Married then, John and Exene wrote original songs about the dark side of life and love on the streets of L.A. and sang in L.A.'s most musical, literary, and visually intriguing band, X. When we met, they asked me to photograph the band. I started photographing X at the Whiskey A Go-Go in Hollywood. When Slash Records used one of my live shots of the band on the back of their first 45, I got to go on their first tour, 6 dates between L.A. and New Orleans. During that tour, I kept an eye out for good locations to make portraits. This candid portrait of John and Exene demonstrates the influence of French photographer Henri Cartier-Bresson on my work. In 1981, X sold all 5,000 seats of LA's Greek Theater. While attending one of the rehearsals for the show, I learned that the rooftop of their building was accessible, so scheduled a photo session there 2 days after the Greek concert. This photograph, employing my dualism narrative, has been used dozens of times to promote X, including a 12-foot by 16-foot rendering at the Grammy Museum for the band's 40th anniversary in 2017. As I got to know musicians in the Hollywood scene, I noticed the talented Steve Berlin, known then as the ubiquitous Steve Berlin because of all the bands he played in night after night. I suggested we do a portrait session on the roof of the $1 Million Hotel Roslyn in downtown L.A. I'd spotted the skyline in the late 70s while working on my documentary series, Fifth and Wall Street, and thought it would be a good backdrop for a solo musician. Steve is known these days as the saxophonist and keyboardist in Los Lobos, and as a multi-Grammy Award-winning producer. Just a few blocks south of where I photographed Steve on the roof of the $1 Million Hotel Roslyn in 1981, right in the heart of Skid Row, is the crossroads of 5th and Wall Street. I was drawn to the area seeking answers to some family history related to an alcoholic grandfather. My documentary project began there with Man Approaching 5th and Wall Street, 1972. The body language of someone down and out is fully expressed in this man's gesture and gait. It's no coincidence that I discovered Robert Frank's book The Americans the year before, and that influenced my work on Skid Row. The Chapman Hotel was on the southeast corner of 5th and Wall Street. Leonard Graham was a resident there who suffered from the disease of alcoholism. Like many I met on Skid Row, Leonard had been successful in life, but family history and the friendly atmosphere of smoky bars proved too hard to resist. Perhaps that's why he could relate to and sing the songs of Hank Williams with such conviction. One did not often meet well-dressed and confident individuals on Skid Row. This man, however, exuded self-respect and a sense of personal pride. He did live in one of the cheap hotels nearby, but was not going to look down and out. Numerous low-priced hotels, pawn shops, bars including the original Hard Rock Cafe, and the Door of Hope Mission dominated the immediate area around 5th and Wall Street. Chapman Hotel was home to many on Social Security and for single-night use. Here on the right of the reception desk, a tattered bikini-clad Raquel Welch warns against drinking in the lobby. Mona was a housekeeper at the Chapman Hotel, where she and her girlfriend Gumby shared this tiny room. Work in the hotel was hard, and the pay was low. Tension in the relationship and outside prejudice during the early days of the gay liberation movement added to the stress of daily living. Even so, their little home was decorated with touches of love and humor. In late 1972, I moved to Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I worked for the magazine East-West Journal and did street photography. One of my early influences was the late Ken Heyman, known for his poignant photographs of children and for his work with cultural anthropologist Margaret Mead. She recognized Heyman's abilities as a storyteller who photographs relationships. Harold Jones, the first director of the Center for Creative Photography, described my work in much the same way. I spent a lot of time photographing the Italian neighborhood of Boston. I've been to Italy and found the North End reminiscent of my experience in the Old World. Shops there focused on single products like meat and produce. Old men gathered to passionately debate current events, and gender roles were perpetuated from birth. As the 1973 baseball season approached, and being a baseball fan, I decided to attend a Red Sox game at Fenway Park. The opening game of the season with the Yankees was sold out. I went to the park anyway, hoping to snag a ticket, and I did, right above first base. One of the greatest rivalries in all of sports began there on April 6th that year. Once in my seat, I chose to photograph the fans at exciting moments. In the years before team logo hats and jerseys were available, it was hard to tell who was rooting for which team except for their expressions. In this ninth-inning photograph, with the Red Sox ahead 15-5, it's easy to pick out at least two Yankees fans. In late summer 1973, I moved back to Los Angeles and was invited to help shoot and edit a documentary film about Skid Row with filmmaker Charles Pavlich. One day while we were walking the beach in Santa Monica, I spotted a man coming our way. He appeared pensive and was deep in thought. Recognizing an opportunity, I quickly moved into position to frame these contrasting elements with the Santa Monica skyline in the background. Living and photographing near the beach in the 1970s provided a number of opportunities to capture humorous scenes like this one. While walking Venice Beach one day in 1978, I encountered this surfer wearing what appears to be a half-price wetsuit. Perhaps there's another explanation for this, one that only surfers would understand. Over in Pasadena during the Rose Parade in 1976, I spotted these two men. Perhaps my greatest influence as a street photographer is Henri Cartier-Bresson. He was the master of the decisive moment, a term he coined. This photograph speaks to that influence, but the dualism is a pure reflection of my original voice. As mentioned, Walker Evans was an early influence. Looking at his photographs of billboards, signs, and buildings helped train my eye to see beyond surfaces, to recognize subtle juxtapositions that add meaning to a storyline. The plethora of cigarette advertising billboards in the 70s and 80s says a lot about promoting the glamour and masculinity associated with smoking. Here at the Stud Bar in North Hollywood, facts and realism are confused in an effort to equate success with smoking. During my work with Charles Pavlich on his documentary film about Skid Row, he and I used to spend a couple of days periodically photographing on the streets of Tijuana, Mexico. One day I came across this trio of brothers decked out in La Lucha's wrestlers' masks. They were babysitting little brother Jesus. In 1976, I had the opportunity to photograph United Farm Workers labor leader Cesar Chavez in Santa Monica when he spoke about the ballot initiative Proposition 14. The LA Free Press published my extensive photo essay about Chavez and the proposition several months later. Many years later, here in Tucson, my portrait of Cesar, fabricated in metal, became an integral part of the Cesar Chavez Labor Bridge Memorial on 6th Avenue, spanning Interstate 10. In 2008, having recently made the digital camera leap, I photographed the Aztec dancers as they led the annual May Day parade on the bridge into downtown Tucson. My portrait of Cesar is seen in the upper right corner. Every year in Tucson, the Coalition to Establish a Cesar Chavez State Holiday organizes the Cesar Chavez March to commemorate the legacy of Arizona's native son, born near Yuma in 1927. This photograph captures the diversity of Chavez's supporters and references humanitarian aid and anti-border wall efforts. In 2012, I returned to Cuba with the delegation Witness for Peace. I say return because as an infant I lived in Miramar, a suburb of Havana. My father worked for Procter & Gamble there. Years later, my mother told me about the horrific living conditions for the poor in Cuba. She supported the revolution when it came, and that inspired me to return. With friends, I returned again in 2013 to explore the central part of the island. In Trinidad, I made Down the Street one of many scenes in my Cuba portfolio. Cobblestone football was made during my return to Trinidad in 2015. Football is very popular in Cuba. These boys played every afternoon. Several soccer balls were often airborne at once. Street photographer Matt Stewart, judge for the 2015 Los Angeles Center of Photography Street Shooters Competition, awarded this photograph second place out of 1,200-plus entries. By chance, I arrived back in Cuba 5 days after the death of Fidel Castro in 2016, and by pure luck I was in Bayamo when his funeral procession passed through on its way to Santiago de Cuba. All around Bayamo, citizens had decorated the fronts of homes and businesses with flags and pictures along the 1959 route of the revolution. Fidel and Raul Castro are seen here proclaiming, "The thriving and victorious revolution will continue." And Che, in a rare portrait, is cut by shadow and light. History tells us that there are two sides to Che, the doctor and the executioner, the light and the shadow. In my first post to this exhibit, I spoke about how Peace March 1969 set the stage for to make photographs employing narratives of dualism. This scene in Australia extends that effort. In Melbourne one day, I stopped to observe Tamil families protesting the genocide of Tamils in Sri Lanka. Tamil Tigers had fought unsuccessfully to create an independent state during the 26-year Civil War. This innocent child, too young to understand, just wanted to reach out to me with her toy wand. In the summer of 2016, I drove from Tucson to Guatemala with members of the Guatemala Project to assist rural Mayans with health concerns and nutritional advice. Driving through Mexico provided one adventure after another related to a teacher strike and government oppression. Once in Guatemala, we set about visiting remote villages such as Union Victoria, where survivors of genocide during the Civil War in the 1980s lived. These cousins lived in modest homes side by side and were inseparable. During 17 years of documenting humanitarian aid in the Sonora, Arizona borderlands, beginning in 2002, I encountered many personal items left behind by migrants on their journeys north, seeking work or family reunification. This photograph of a young girl's dress is just one of many to be seen in my book and on the cover of Along the Migrant Trail. Along the Migrant Trail, a Borderlands Portrait was published by Frontera Nueva Books in Los Angeles in 2019 and was a 2020 Grand Prize finalist in the Eric Hoffer Book Award competition. It also received honorable mention in the culture category. About the book, publisher Rex Weiner writes, Along the Migrant Trail delivers a powerful view of one of today's most controversial journeys, the migratory passage of thousands of men, women, and children. We see their faces and the faces of those coming to their aid, undaunted by the physical and political challenges, in an unforgettable portrait of humanity in action, preserving and celebrating the lives of those in need. More information about my photographs and books is available at michael-hyatt.com. Thank you for joining me at my 50th anniversary retrospective in Galleria Sanita, Tucson, Arizona.